Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samuel Wong Guojing, and today I'll be discussing whether the courts have been fair in imposing constructive trust, even when no trust was intended by the parties involved. So, constructive trust differs from an express trust because it arises through the operation of law rather than the intention of the parties. In West Duche Bank case, Lord Brown Wilkinson explained that a constructive trust arises where the conscience of the legal owner is affected, making it unconscionable for that person to deny another person's beneficial interest. This presentation evaluates that courts are generally fair in imposing constructive trust although concerns about certainty arise in family property disputes. Now, the first category where constructive trusts are clearly justified is where they remove gains obtained through unlawful conduct, such as fraud, bribery, or theft. In these situations, courts are not dealing with voluntary agreements or balancing expectations, but responding directly to wrongdoing. The key idea is that the defendant has acted unconscionably, so equity steps in to prevent them from keeping benefits gained through that conduct. In FHR European Ventures LP against the Capital Partners LLC, the Supreme Court held that a secret commission received by an agent constituted a constructive trust in favor of the principal. The court confirmed that such payments are treated as beneficially owned by the principal because they are acquired in breach of the agent's duty of honesty and transparency. The significance of this approach lies in the fact that equity is not creating a new entitlement, but instead recognizing that the gain should never have been retained by the wrongdoer in the first place. From an analytical perspective, this line of authority reflects a corrective justice function rather than a discretionary redistribution of property rights. The intervention is justified because the legal system is responding directly to the existence of wrongdoing that distorts the proper allocation of property. As Tang Hang Wu and Yin Kai Liu observe, constructive trusts are most defensible where they function to reverse unjust enrichment arising from misconduct, ensuring that legal title does not legitimize illegitimate gains. Accordingly, this ensures coherence between legal title and moral entitlement because the court's role is limited to stripping away gains that are morally and legally tainted. This avoids the problem of recognizing ownership based on fraud or corruption. In this sense, the constructive trust ensures that legal ownership aligns with equitable conscience. Now, a stricter use of constructive trust appears in fiduciary relationships, where equity imposes liability even if no actual loss can be shown. The focus is not just on correcting wrongdoing, but on preventing conflicts of interest and ensuring complete loyalty from fiduciaries. In Industrials Development Consultants Ltd against Cooley, the defendant, while acting as managing director, resigned and personally secured a contract that had arisen through his fiduciary position. The court required him to account for the profit, not because the company suffered loss, but because the opportunity was acquired through misuse of position. The legal principle is therefore stricter than general unjust enrichment. Fiduciary must avoid conflicts of interest and must not place themselves in a position where personal gain is derived from their day-bound role. This strictness is supported by Mark J. Bennett, who argues that constructive trust in fiduciary contexts reinforce institutional trust by ensuring that fiduciaries remain fully accountable to the obligations of loyalty, honesty, and good faith. On this view, the doctrine serves a systematic function. It preserves confidence in fiduciary and commercial relationships by removing any incentive for self-interested behavior. However, the justification for fairness in this category is not grounded in correcting wrongful enrichment alone, but in deterrence and preventative regulation. The rule applies irrespective of loss or actual harm because equity prioritizes the integrity of fiduciary conduct over transactional outcomes. This distinguishes fiduciary constructive trust from unlawful gain cases. Even absent measurable damage, the mere existence of conflict or misuse of position is sufficient to trigger equitable intervention. Therefore, although the consequences may appear strict, constructive trust in fiduciary cases are justified because fairness here is not outcome based but standard based, prioritizing loyalty, over loss. Now, the third category involves constructive trust imposed to prevent unconscionable conduct in land dealings and informal agreements. In Bannister against Bannister, the claimant transferred property at undervalue based on an oral promise that she could live there rent-free for life. The defendant later attempted to rely on statutory formalities to evict her. The court imposed a constructive trust because it would have been unconscionable to allow the defendant to deny the profit after benefiting from the arrangement. The decision was fair because equity should not allow legal formalities to become instruments of fraud. The claimant relied upon promise to her detriment, and the court appropriately intervened to prevent injustice. Annika Newnham explains that constructive trust in such situations perform an important protective function by safeguarding informal reliance-based arrangements, where parties act based on mutual understandings rather than formal agreements. However, she also warns that the absence of clear legal boundaries may create uncertainty and unpredictability in property law, because courts are often required to determine fairness based on the specific facts of each case. Nevertheless, the case demonstrates that courts have generally been fair in imposing constructive trust where intervention is necessary to prevent one party from unconscionably benefiting at another person's expense. From an evaluative perspective, fairness here lies in protecting reliance and preventing opportunistic exploitation. However, the tension is that courts must infer obligations where no formal agreement exists, which risks unpredictability. Thus, fairness exists, but is achieved at the cost of reduced doctrinal certainty. Now, the most controversial area concerns common intention constructive trust involving family homes and cohabiting couples. Instead, against Dowden, the House of Lords considered the whole course of dealing between the parties in determining beneficial ownership rather than focusing solely on financial contribution. The principle established is that courts may infer or impute intention based on the conduct of the parties to achieve fairness in domestic relationships. This is arguably fair because domestic partnerships often involve indirect contribution, such as childcare, household management, and emotional labor, which legal ownership fails to recognize. However, this area has been heavily criticized for giving courts excessively broad discretion in determining beneficial ownership in family home disputes. Yi Chun Leung argues that decisions such as Ted against Dowden and Jones against Connaught demonstrate how courts increasingly rely on inferred or imputed intention rather than clear evidence of agreements, leading to inconsistency and unpredictability. Similar, Susan Jacqueline Buckhill Thomas argues that the overlap between constructive trust and property estoppel has blurred the traditional boundaries, while Tang Hang-Wu further criticized the courts for relying too heavily on broad notions of fairness at the expense of principal legal reasoning and certainty in property ownership. These criticisms are persuasive because outcomes in common intention constructive trust cases often depend heavily on judicial interpretation of conduct and intention rather than clear legal rules. As a result, parties may struggle to predict their proprietary rights with certainty, creating difficulties not only for cohabiting couples but also for third parties dealing with the property. Therefore, although flexibility allows courts to achieve substantive fairness in domestic relationship, excessive discretion risks undermining consistency and legal certainty in property law. From an evaluation standpoint, this area reflects the strongest tension in the doctrine. Courts achieve fairness in individual domestic disputes, but at the expense of predictability for future parties and third-party purchasers. Now, courts have also imposed constructive trust upon third parties who become involved in breaches of trust. In Royal Brunei Airlines Sdn Bhd against Tan, the defendant dishonestly assisted in a breach of trust involving trust funds. The Privy Council imposed liability for dishonest assistance. The principle established in that the party who knowingly participate in breaches of trust may be held liable as constructive trustees. The decision was fair because individuals who knowingly assist breaches of trust should not escape responsibility merely because they are not former trustees. However, courts have also recognized the need to protect innocent recipients. In Re Montagu Settlement Trust, liability was not imposed because the recipient lacked sufficient knowledge that the transfer involved trust property. This demonstrates that courts attempt to balance fairness with protection of innocent parties. Harminder Singh Iqbal Singh, Safinas Muhammad Hussain, and Nur Khalida Dalan argues that constructive trust liabilities should carefully balance accountability with fairness towards innocent recipients. Therefore, fairness is calibrated through knowledge thresholds. Now, in conclusion, courts have generally been fair in enforcing constructive trust because the doctrine ensures that equity responds to unconscionable conduct and prevents individuals from retaining benefits obtained through wrongdoing. This reflects equity's core function of protecting conscience and maintaining accountability in property and fiduciary relationships. However, the assessment of fairness is less straightforward in cases involving family homes and common intention constructive trust, where outcomes depend heavily on judicial interpretation and may therefore lack consistency and predictability. The doctrine is therefore fair in principle, but uneven in application. Thank you. And this will be my references. Thank you.